In today's video, I'm going to be explaining to you guys 3 things that wildlife photographers are afraid to do. And these are all things that in most cases would help improve our images, but because of the potential risk of missing shots that these things create, we often end up not doing them and being afraid to do these things. And these are all going to be things that are related to the technical side of photography and your settings. It's not going to be stuff like, afraid to photograph a certain species of wildlife or anything like that. This is all related to photography settings when shooting wildlife. So the first thing that wildlife photographers are afraid to do is going to be use a high ISO. And there's always immediately a negative connotation when you bring up ISOs, because obviously as ISO increases, you get grainier images. An image shot at ISO 100 is going to be a lot more clean and a lot less grainy than an image shot at, say, ISO 10,000. And so because of that, a lot of wildlife photographers are afraid to use a high ISO, and they end up doing one of 2 things to compensate. They either don't shoot when lighting is low, because when you have bright lighting, good lighting, you don't typically have to use a high ISO, or they just lower their shutter speed some. And while these might sound like good ideas in theory because you're able to keep your ISO low, they're actually pretty detrimental on your images as well, oftentimes more detrimental than using a high ISO. And the reason for that is because, number one, if we're taking a look at shooting when light is not low, you're missing out on so many photographic opportunities. Not only do you get some really nice lighting conditions when the sun gets low on the horizon that'll add a nice golden glow to your images, or even when the sun goes down and it's blue hour, you get that nice blue twilight hue in your images. Not only are you missing out on those lighting conditions, but you're also missing out on a lot of wildlife activity, because many species, most species actually, are most active in the early morning and late evening, which is when you have that very low lighting and when you need to use a higher ISO. And so by not shooting at these times, not only are you missing out on some of the best lighting of the day, but you're also missing out on some of the best wildlife activity of the day. And so there are tons of great shots out there that you're simply never going to get because you won't shoot when lighting is low, because you don't want to raise your ISO up. And here's how I look at this issue. You're better off going out there and at least trying to get good photos when the lighting is great, when you can get a nice rim-lit animal out on the landscape, or, nice blue hour lighting on your animals, or even just, like I said earlier, the wildlife activity is best during this time, so you might capture some really cool and interesting behavior that you wouldn't capture at other times of the day. You're better off going out and trying to get images in these conditions and coming away with noisy shots than just not going out and shooting at all. Because the thing is, with the software that we have today and the right amount of post-processing, you can really clean up a lot of noisy images. And even if you go out and you shoot and they're so noisy that you simply can't clean them up, well then, okay, there's nothing you can really do about that, but at least you went out and got some practice. And if you do go out and they're not too noisy, you might have had to raise that ISO up more than you feel comfortable, but if the images are still okay and they're not too grainy, and you're able to take those images and then apply some of the awesome software that we have available to us today, like Topaz Denoise AI, then you come away with great shots and beautiful lighting. And they're shots that you never would have gotten if you hadn't pushed yourself outside of your comfort zone, went out there in those low light conditions and jacked that ISO up way higher than you typically like to. So really in these situations, I think that it's worth it to go out there and try. And you really may come away with something that, even though the ISO might be higher than you like, it still could be a great shot. And you can still have a shot at, applying some of these softwares like Topaz and denoising those images. And then in the case of the other scenario, when you lower your shutter speed, I don't see this as a good option either, because the thing is, oftentimes when you're lowering your shutter speed down with wildlife and you have these animals moving in the frame, you end up lowering it too low to try to compensate for ISO, so then you get motion blur in your images, and you end up with images that aren't sharp. In my personal opinion, at least, I would rather have a tack sharp image that is grainy than a blurry image where I can't even tell what the animal's doing. So the point is, it's better to just not be afraid of ISOs, and if you have to raise them super high, then raise them super high. That's okay. Don't sacrifice shutter speed and risk getting blurry shots, and don't sacrifice the best lighting of the day, all just because you're afraid to raise up your ISO. Let me interject here to remind you all that I'm going to be giving away a free trip to Alaska where you and I will go to Lake Clark National Park to photograph coastal Alaskan brown bears when I hit 10,000 subscribers. All you have to do for a chance to enter is be a subscriber to the channel, and then when I hit 10K, I'm going to select a winner. So you guys know what to do. Hit that subscribe button down below, and then when we hit 10K, join me in Alaska. Now, the second thing that wildlife photographers are afraid to do is turn off image stabilization. And I know a lot of you are out there hearing this and saying, what do you mean? We should always have image stabilization on these big long lenses where, we need that extra stabilization to, be able to get nice sharp shots. And yes, that is 100% accurate in most cases. I would say at least 90% of the time I shoot with image stabilization on. For the most part, you should have it on. But a lot of photographers are hesitant to turn it off when they really need to. And one of those situations would be when you're shooting super fast action, such as birds in flight or, an animal running, and you're getting up to those shutter speeds that are around or above a 2500th of a second. When you're shooting at shutter speeds that high, you need to turn image stabilization off. Because what image stabilization actually does is it tries to compensate for any shake or motion or blur that you or the camera may create while taking an image. And when you're shooting at shutter speeds that high, at maybe 1/2500th of a second or above, the image is taken so fast that there is no room for error. There is no time for motion blur or for your hand to accidentally shake the camera and end up creating a less sharp image. And so what ends up happening in these scenarios is that image stabilization tries to compensate for something that's not there. It tries to stabilize for motion blur or camera shake that is non-existent because the photo is taken so fast that there's no time for camera shake to occur. And so what it actually ends up doing is creating more blur in your images when you shoot with image stabilization on at these very high shutter speeds, because it's trying to compensate for that camera shake, and when that camera shake's not there, it ends up just applying that camera shake to the image and creating a more blurry photo. So while it might seem counterintuitive to turn your image stabilization off when you shoot at super high shutter speeds and you're shooting fast action, because you think, when you're having to track these fast moving animals, that's when you need stabilization the most to help you track. But it's actually the opposite. You need to be turning it off in those situations so that it doesn't try to compensate for something that isn't there and end up creating blur in your images. And before I move on to the third thing, I do want to mention that one other case where you might want to turn image stabilization off is when you're shooting on a tripod and you're shooting at a shutter speed of maybe, above 1/400th of a second or maybe 1/500th of a second. This one's a little bit more variable in what you can do because it depends on how stable your tripod is and how stable you're able to keep the camera on that tripod. But generally, when you're shooting on a tripod, you want to have image stabilization off as well, because a tripod acts very similarly to how those very fast shutter speeds do. It acts as a stabilizer itself. There isn't really too much room for possible camera shake or motion blur, and so image stabilization ends up trying to compensate for something that isn't there. So in most cases on a tripod, you also want to turn it off. You may need stabilization on a tripod if you're shooting super low light and you're trying to do like, maybe 1/30th of a second with a big 600mm lens on there or something, and you're on a tripod, then maybe you still want to have image stabilization on. But, even in those cases, if you're holding it steady enough on that tripod, you really may not need image stabilization. So it really depends on what you're trying to do, but generally on a tripod as well, if you're shooting at a very fast shutter speed, you can turn image stabilization off in those cases as well. And then the third and final thing that wildlife photographers are afraid to do is shoot in manual mode. And this is one that's a little more up for debate over whether you should do it or not, because, a lot of people argue that it's better to shoot in aperture priority or to shoot with auto ISO or different things like this because you're ensuring that you have a good exposure when you take a shot. You're less likely to underexpose or overexpose a photo. And there's a really great argument to be made there. But in my personal opinion, I think it's better to learn your camera better, to master your skills better, and to just always shoot in manual. Yes, it's more difficult. Yes, you're more likely to underexpose or overexpose shots on accident, but when shooting in manual, you just have so much more control over those three crucial settings: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And those are things that I really believe you need to have full control over when you're out in the field shooting. I would rather have full control of my shutter speed, aperture, and ISO and make sure that I have every setting exactly where I want it to make sure that I'm getting the best shot that I think that I can possibly get, than to not have control of one of those, such as, putting it on auto ISO or on aperture priority and just letting the camera choose for me, and then potentially getting settings that I'm not happy with on that photo. Even if it's exposed correctly, if it didn't pick the settings that I want and the shutter speed's not fast enough or the ISO is way too high for what I wanted, then there's no point in having the image anyways. So this one is definitely more up for debate than the other two. I think there are some really great arguments to be made for using auto ISO. But personally, I would rather just shoot in manual and make sure that I have full control over my settings at all times. And I recommend that you guys, if you haven't shot in full manual before, at least give it a try for a short amount of time. You are probably going to miss shots because you're going to have to get used to adjusting all three of those settings very quickly on the fly to compensate for whatever scenario is happening in front of you. But I think it's worth at least pushing yourself out of your comfort zone and trying it and seeing if you like it better to have full control over your camera as opposed to using one of these other methods like auto ISO, aperture priority. And if it's not for you, then you'll learn that when you test it and figure it out and, you know, see if you like shooting in manual or not. So bringing it all back together here, number one, you need to not be afraid to jack up those ISOs and use a high ISO when necessary. Number two, you need to not be afraid to turn off image stabilization. Even if it seems counterintuitive, it can really help your photos when you're shooting at very high shutter speeds. And number three, you need to give shooting in manual a shot. It might not be for you. Like I said, I know of some phenomenal photographers that I greatly respect who use some of the other methods, but it might end up being the best thing that you've ever done, and you might really love having full control over your settings. And with that, guys, those are the three things that I can think of that wildlife photographers are afraid to do. If you guys can think of anything else, drop that down in the comments below. I'd love to hear some of your guys' thoughts on, things that typically we wildlife photographers try to shy away from that might actually end up helping our images. And let me know your thoughts on the three things that I listed down there in the comments as well. With that, guys, I want to remind you all to subscribe for that 10,000 subscriber Alaska trip giveaway. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I will see you all in the next one.